Imagine this. You are Marcus Aurelius Septimius, a 17-year-old son of a wealthy senator, standing in the massive caldarium of the Baths of Caracalla in the year 214 after Christ. Steam rises from pools large enough to drown 100 men. Marble columns tower above you, their surfaces slick with condensation. The air is thick with perfumed oils and something else, something that makes your stomach turn. You were summoned here by imperial decree, told it was an honor to attend the emperor's private bathing ceremony. But the dozen other young men around you, all from Rome's most powerful families, share the same look of barely concealed terror. The heavy bronze doors behind you slam shut. Emperor Caracalla emerges from the shadows, his muscular frame glistening with oil, his eyes scanning each of you like a butcher evaluating livestock. What you don't know yet is that some of you won't leave this bathhouse the same. Some won't leave at all. The Baths of Caracalla weren't just the largest bathing complex in ancient Rome. They were Emperor Caracalla's personal theater of power, degradation, and systematic exploitation on a scale that would define his reign of terror from 211 to 217 after Christ. What historians have carefully omitted from textbooks, what classical scholars have sanitized into discussions of Roman bathing culture, was actually a carefully orchestrated system of imperial abuse that used the cover of Roman tradition to commit atrocities against the empire's most vulnerable. Think the Roman Empire was all military conquest and political intrigue? Think again. Behind the marble facades and architectural marvels was something far more sinister. And when construction began on his massive bath complex in 212 after Christ, occupying over 27 acres in the heart of Rome, he wasn't just building a monument to public health. He was constructing the largest enclosed space in the ancient world where he could exercise power without witnesses, where the steam and architecture created perfect cover for activities that would have scandalized even Rome's permissive society. The architectural layout reveals the calculation behind his design. The caldarium, the hottest room, could accommodate thousands during public hours. But Caracalla added something no other bath complex possessed: private chambers accessible only through hidden passages, rooms where the thick walls muffled sound and the constant steam obscured vision. These weren't for imperial privacy. They were for imperial impunity. Marcus's first clue that something was wrong came when the emperor's personal guards, the Praetorian prefect's most trusted men, positioned themselves at every exit, not to protect the emperor, to prevent escape. The young men were told to disrobe completely, following Roman bathing custom. But then Caracalla began circling them, making comments about their physical development, their family lineages, their usefulness to the empire. His words carried implications that made the steam seem cold by comparison. What happened next in that caldarium has been documented in fragments of Cassius Dio's histories, in the terrified letters senators sent to relatives in distant provinces, in the whispered warnings that spread through Rome's elite families. The emperor didn't just abuse his power. He made it a performance, forcing the young men to participate in degrading competitions, testing their limits of humiliation before moving to more intimate violations. Those who resisted were marked. Their families would face charges of treason. Their property would be seized. Their very existence could be erased from official records. But here's where it gets truly twisted. This wasn't a single incident. It was a system. The bathhouse operated on a dual schedule, that became clear to anyone paying attention. Public hours from dawn until the 8th hour, when citizens of all classes could use the facilities. Then came the closing, when workers would clear the complex, supposedly for cleaning and maintenance. But the baths didn't actually close. They transformed. Imperial guards would arrive with lists of names. Summons would be delivered to specific households. Young men and women from senatorial families, from wealthy merchant clans, from families that Caracalla wanted to control, would receive invitations that weren't invitations at all. The procurement system was brutally efficient. Provincial governors throughout the empire received quotas. Each province was expected to provide tribute not just in grain and gold, but in youth of exceptional beauty and refinement. The official documents called them gifts for imperial service. The reality was human trafficking sanctioned at the highest levels of government. Ships arrived in Ostia, Rome's port, carrying cargoes that included people alongside marble and spices. Herodian's histories, written decades later, describe the systematic nature of these operations. The emperor maintained detailed records of potential victims, organized by age, physical characteristics, and family connections. This wasn't random predation. It was calculated domination. By targeting the children of powerful families, Caracalla ensured their parents' political compliance. Senatorial opposition to his policies evaporated when senators understood their families could be summoned to the baths at any moment. The bath complex itself became a factory of control. Different rooms served different purposes. The frigidarium, usually for cold plunges, became an interrogation chamber where political enemies were brought to witness what the emperor could do with impunity. The tepidarium's moderate temperatures made it ideal for the extended sessions where Caracalla would gather groups of victims and force them into scenarios designed to break their psychological resistance. The caldarium, with its intense heat and obscuring steam, provided cover for the worst activities. What you're witnessing through Marcus's eyes is just the entry point to a horror that stretched across the empire. That first night in the bathhouse changed him forever. He returned home physically intact, but psychologically shattered, unable to speak of what he'd witnessed without trembling. His father, a senator who had supported Caracalla's claim to sole rule after the emperor murdered his own brother Geta in 211 after Christ, now understood the price of that support. Silence bought survival, but survival required sacrificing your children to imperial entertainment. The testimony of other survivors, preserved in fragments of court records discovered centuries later, reveals patterns that would be familiar to anyone studying systematic abuse. The emperor cultivated favorites among his victims, young men who accepted their role in exchange for positions of minor authority. These collaborators would help identify new victims, would participate in the degradation of newcomers, would enforce the emperor's will within the bathhouse walls. The psychology was deliberate. Divide the victims, create hierarchies of suffering, ensure no unified resistance could form. Now that you've witnessed how Caracalla transformed Rome's greatest public work into a private nightmare, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden in history's shadows. If uncovering these buried truths resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience behind imperial power, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about Roman civilization, about the nature of absolute power, and about how systematic exploitation operates when unchecked by any moral authority. Because what comes next reveals how this wasn't just about one emperor's depravity. It was about an entire system that enabled, protected, and profited from his crimes. The scale of the procurement operation reveals the true horror of Caracalla's bathhouse system. This wasn't opportunistic abuse by a single depraved emperor. It was an institutional apparatus that employed hundreds of people, consumed vast resources, and operated with the efficiency of any other imperial bureaucracy. The same administrative capacity that built aqueducts and conquered territories was turned toward identifying, transporting, and delivering human beings to satisfy imperial appetites. Provincial governors throughout the empire faced impossible choices: refused the emperor's demands for tribute and faced charges of insubordination that meant death and the seizure of all property. Comply and become complicit in crimes that would haunt them until their deaths. Letters preserved in archaeological archives show governors attempting to negotiate, trying to substitute gold for human tributes, seeking any alternative to destroying families in their provinces. Caracalla rejected every attempt at substitution. He wanted specifically what he demanded, and he had the power to take it. The logistics alone were staggering. Transport ships had to be arranged, guards assigned to prevent escape during the long voyages from distant provinces. Housing established near the baths for those waiting their turn to be summoned. Medical examinations conducted to verify age and health. All of this required coordination between multiple government departments, each performing their assigned role in the larger operation. The banality of evil centuries before anyone coined that phrase. Documentation from Egypt provides the clearest picture of how this system functioned at the provincial level. The prefect of Egypt, Subatianus Aquila, maintained detailed records of tribute payments from 213 to 215 after Christ. Among the lists of grain shipments and tax receipts appear entries for gifts of youth sent to Rome. The clinical language barely masks the human tragedy. 15 individuals, ages 12 to 17, selected for imperial service. Their names are recorded, their families' properties noted, the ships they traveled on documented. What happened to these specific individuals? Some survived their time in Caracalla's bathhouse and returned to Egypt with positions in the imperial administration, forever marked by their experiences, forever complicit in maintaining the system that had victimized them. Others simply vanished from records, their fates unrecorded, their families left to imagine horrors that probably didn't match the reality. A few, according to fragmentary testimonies, died in the bathhouse itself, their deaths covered up as accidents or illnesses, their bodies returned to families with warnings about discussing the circumstances. The architectural modifications Caracalla made to the bath complex reveal how he adapted the structure to serve his purposes. Hidden passages connected the public areas to private chambers that weren't included in the original plans. Soundproofing techniques, borrowed from theater construction, were applied to certain rooms. Specialized furniture appeared in areas supposedly used for massage and medical treatment, furniture whose purpose became clear only when understanding what activities occurred there. The emperor spent his own funds, not public treasury money, on these modifications, leaving a trail of receipts that historians would find centuries later. The staff who maintained the bathhouse during private hours formed their own strange community of enablers and survivors. Slaves who worked there understood they were trapped in a nightmare, but had no means of escape. Some were forced to participate directly in activities. Others served as cleaners, removing evidence of what had occurred, washing away the physical traces of abuse. Still others worked as suppliers, procuring specific items the emperor demanded for his entertainments. Each person in this system carried knowledge that could destroy them if spoken aloud. But some did speak. Years later, after Caracalla's assassination in 217 after Christ, investigations by his successor Macrinus uncovered testimonies from former bath attendants. These accounts, preserved in legal archives, describe in clinical detail the system of abuse that operated within those walls. The timing of sessions, usually late afternoon through midnight. The rotation of victims, never the same individuals 2 days consecutively to prevent bonding or organize resistance. The presence of witnesses who were actually enforcers, there to ensure participation and punish refusal. The psychological manipulation employed to maintain this system would be analyzed by modern psychologists as textbook coercive control. Caracalla deliberately created conditions where victims felt responsible for their own abuse. He would offer choices that weren't really choices, participate willingly and receive rewards, or resist and face consequences that extended to entire families. Most chose participation, then carried guilt for that choice for the rest of their lives. The emperor understood that breaking people psychologically ensured their silence more effectively than any threat. The Roman elite's response to discovering what was happening in the baths reveals the moral bankruptcy of the imperial system. Senators knew, military commanders knew. Even the Praetorian Guard, supposedly protectors of the emperor and Rome, knew exactly what occurred during those private sessions. Yet opposition remained muted, scattered, ineffective. The same fear that kept victims silent kept potential rescuers paralyzed. Speaking out meant becoming the next victim, meant watching your own children summoned to the bathhouse. Some families attempted desperate measures to protect their children. Arranged marriages at preposterously young ages, hoping martial status would provide exemption. Sending sons to distant military postings, as far from Rome as possible. Even deliberate physical harm. Injuries that would make young men less attractive for imperial attention. The extent of these protective efforts demonstrates how widely the danger was understood, how thoroughly Caracalla's reach was feared. The connection between bathhouse activities and imperial policy becomes clear when examining Caracalla's political decisions during this period. Senators who opposed his military campaigns found their sons summoned for extended service at the baths. Provincial governors who questioned tax increases received reminders about their obligation to provide tribute in all forms. Military commanders who showed insufficient loyalty discovered their families were no longer safe in Rome. The bathhouse became a tool of political control as much as personal gratification. But the emperor made a fatal miscalculation. By victimizing children of the military elite, he created enemies within the only force capable of deposing him. Praetorian commanders whose sons had been abused, legion officers whose families had been destroyed, began coordinating in secret. The assassination that finally ended Caracalla's reign in April 217 after Christ wasn't just about imperial succession or political power. It was revenge enacted by men who had waited years for the opportunity to strike. The months leading up to his death show Caracalla growing increasingly paranoid, sensing the conspiracy forming around him, but unable to identify specific threats because potential threats were everywhere. He increased security at the baths, limited attendance at private sessions, even reduced the frequency of summons. But the damage was done. Too many families had been destroyed. Too many futures had been ruined. Too many survivors carried knowledge and anger that could only be satisfied by the emperor's death. Here's what makes this truly haunting. The system didn't die with Caracalla. The bathhouse continued operating for decades afterward, though subsequent emperors avoided using it for private entertainments. The procurement networks established to supply victims were simply redirected to other purposes. The survivors of Caracalla's abuse moved into positions of power themselves, some perpetuating similar abuses in smaller scale, others working to prevent such horrors from recurring. The institutional knowledge of how to systematically exploit the vulnerable remained embedded in imperial administration. The archaeological evidence provides a different kind of testimony. Excavations of the bath complex in modern times have revealed those hidden chambers, the private rooms whose purpose becomes obvious when understanding the context. Graffiti scratched into walls, messages from victims that survived millennia. Physical evidence of modifications made to accommodate specific activities. All of this confirms what written sources only hint at. This wasn't exaggeration by hostile historians, but documented reality preserved in stone and tile. Coming up is the revelation that connects everything, the truth that transforms understanding of Caracalla's entire reign. Because what happened in the bathhouse wasn't separate from his other crimes. It was the foundation. The murder of Geta, Caracalla's younger brother and co-emperor, in December 211 after Christ, is usually taught as political necessity. Brothers competing for soul power, one eliminating the other to avoid civil war. But testimonies from guards present at the assassination reveal something more disturbing. Geta wasn't just killed for political reasons. He had discovered what was happening in the bathhouse complex, then under construction. He had threatened to expose his brother's plans, to prevent the transformation of public works into private nightmares. That discovery signed his death warrant. The assassination itself took place in their mother Julia Domna's apartments, with Caracalla ordering guards to cut down Geta while he sought protection in their mother's arms. Julia, who would later take poison rather than serve Caracalla's successor, witnessed her son's murder and understood in that moment exactly what kind of monster her surviving son had become. The blood that stained her clothes that day represented not just family tragedy, but the price of knowledge about imperial crimes. What followed Geta's murder was a purge unprecedented even by Roman standards. 20,000 people, maybe more, killed on charges of supporting the dead co-emperor. But analysis of the victim lists reveals something historians have missed. A disproportionate number were young men from families Caracalla had already targeted for bathhouse summons, or fathers who had shown signs of protective resistance to imperial demands. The purge wasn't just about eliminating political opposition. It was about silencing witnesses and removing threats to the bathhouse system before it fully operational. The guards who carried out these executions later provided testimony during Macrinus's investigation that paints a chilling picture. They described being given specific names, specific families, with instructions that left no ambiguity about the reasons for elimination. One praetorian, Quintus Gavius, testified that he was ordered to kill a senator's entire family including children as young as 8 years old, because the senator had attempted to remove his teenage son from Rome to avoid imperial attention. The message was clear. Resistance would be punished with annihilation. The bathhouse, fully operational by 213 after Christ, became the center of Caracalla's daily routine. He would spend hours there, not just during evening sessions, but throughout the day, using different rooms for different purposes. Morning hours might be spent in genuine exercise and bathing. Afternoon sessions involved political meetings where senators and commanders would be summoned, forced to conduct business while navigating the implicit threat of remaining after public closing. Evening brought the private sessions that have been our focus, the systematic abuse that defined his reign. The guards stationed permanently at the bath complex formed a separate unit within the Praetorian Guard, men selected for loyalty and willingness to participate in or ignore crimes. They were paid triple standard wages and given extensive privileges, creating incentive to maintain silence. But even generous payment couldn't prevent knowledge from spreading. Lower-ranked guards talked to families, whispered warnings to friends, attempted in small ways to mitigate horrors they were powerless to prevent. One such guard, Marcus Julius Philippus, kept a private diary that was discovered in the 19th century during renovation of a building in Rome that had been constructed over ancient foundations. His entries provide day-by-day accounts of bathhouse operations, written in careful code to avoid detection if found. The diary describes specific individuals summoned, approximate numbers of victims, frequency of sessions, and occasional notes about the emperor's state of mind. Philippus's motivation for keeping these records remains unclear, but he preserved evidence that would have been lost otherwise. The most disturbing entries describe family groups summoned together, parents forced to witness their children's degradation, siblings required to participate in each other's abuse, entire households destroyed in single sessions designed to demonstrate the emperor's absolute power. These weren't spontaneous cruelties. They were calculated psychological warfare, experiments in determining how thoroughly human dignity could be destroyed while keeping victims alive and functional. The emperor had access to philosophical and medical texts discussing human endurance limits, and he apparently conducted practical research. The normalization of this horror throughout Roman society remains the most difficult aspect to comprehend. How did an entire civilization know what was happening yet continue functioning normally? How did senators conduct debates, merchants trade goods, citizens attend games, while understanding that imperial bathhouse continued operating every night? The answer lies in the diffusion of responsibility, the same psychological mechanism that enables systematic evil in any era. Everyone could tell themselves they weren't directly involved. The senators who provided their children told themselves they were protecting their families from worse fate. The guards who stood watch told themselves they were just following orders. The administrators who processed tribute told themselves they were simply doing their jobs. The citizens who heard whispers told themselves these were exaggerations, couldn't possibly be as bad as rumored. This collective self-deception allowed the system to persist for years. But some refused to normalize the horror. Provincial governors who resigned rather than comply with tribute demands, though such resignation usually meant financial ruin and exile. Military commanders who requested transfers to distant frontiers, choosing professional stagnation over proximity to Rome. families who liquidated their wealth and left Italy entirely, abandoning positions built over generations rather than risk their children. These acts of resistance were individual, scattered, insufficient to stop the system, but sufficient to demonstrate that moral courage remained possible even under totalitarian evil. The economic impact of Caracalla's bathhouse system extended throughout the empire. The resources devoted to construction, maintenance, and operations were staggering. But the hidden costs were equally significant. Families impoverished themselves attempting to protect children. Provincial economies disrupted by tribute demands. Commercial relationships destroyed when trading partners' families were victimized. The bathhouse consumed not just individuals, but the social fabric that held the empire together. Medical knowledge from the period reveals another dimension of the horror. Physicians attached to the bathhouse were required to treat victims after sessions, ensuring they survived to maintain appearances. These doctors, bound by their service to the emperor, provided care while saying nothing about the obvious causes of injuries. Some left behind medical texts that discussed treatments without naming what caused the conditions they addressed. Reading between the lines of these clinical descriptions reveals the full scope of physical harm being inflicted. The religious response to Caracalla's crimes was complicated by the emperor's relationship with Eastern cults. He claimed devotion to Serapis, the Greco-Egyptian deity, and incorporated exotic religious practices into his bathhouse activities, framing abuse as sacred ritual. This perversion of religion served dual purposes, providing justification for actions that violated Roman moral standards and compromising religious authorities who accepted imperial patronage. Temples that received Caracalla's donations implicitly accepted his interpretation of religious duty. You came into this story thinking Caracalla was just another brutal Roman emperor, one among many in a violent era. Now you leave understanding that his crimes at the baths of Caracalla represented systematic exploitation on an institutional scale, transforming public infrastructure into private nightmare, weaponizing state power against the empire's own citizens, particularly its most vulnerable youth. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of discovery has awakened your appetite for truth, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that textbooks won't teach. Your curiosity about the real human experience behind imperial power deserves to be fed, because while others believe sanitized versions of history, you'll know what really happened in those steam-filled chambers where screams were muffled by marble walls and absolute power revealed its truest nature. The assassination of Caracalla came on April 8, 217 after Christ, during a military campaign in Mesopotamia. The emperor stopped to relieve himself on the roadside, a moment of vulnerability that Julius Martialis, a Praetorian guard, exploited to strike the fatal blow. Official histories claim Martialis was angry about being denied promotion, but investigations after revealed his brother had been among the victims of bathhouse sessions 2 years earlier. The assassination wasn't just political. It was personal revenge by someone who had lost family to imperial depravity. Marcus Aurelius Septimius, the senator's son we met at the beginning, survived his time in Caracalla's bathhouse. He lived to see the emperor's death, even attended the public celebrations that followed news of the assassination. But he never fully recovered from what he experienced in those steam-filled chambers. He never married, never had children, spent the remainder of his life managing his family's estates in rural Italy, as far from Rome and its bathhouses as he could get. His private letters, preserved by descendants, speak of nightmares that never stopped, of triggers that brought back memories decades after the events themselves. The Baths of Caracalla continued operating for another 3 centuries, one of Rome's architectural marvels, a testament to engineering genius and imperial ambition. Citizens bathed there throughout late antiquity, mostly unaware or deliberately ignorant of what had occurred in those same rooms generations earlier. The complex finally fell into disuse in the 6th century after Christ, when aqueducts feeding it were cut during Gothic sieges. Today it stands as ruins, tourist attraction, venue for outdoor concerts, its dark history known only to specialists who study this particular corner of imperial crime. The lesson of Caracalla's bathhouse is about the corruption of institutions by unchecked power. It's about how systems designed for public good can be perverted to serve private evil. It's about the responsibility of citizens who know crimes are being committed in their name, yet choose comfort over confrontation. It's about the survivors who carry trauma long after their abusers have turned to dust. And it's about the importance of remembering these hidden histories, of not allowing time and distance to sanitize horrors that deserve to be named and understood in their full depravity. The steam has long since dissipated from the caldarium where Marcus stood trembling at 17 years old. The bronze doors that trapped him and others have corroded away. The marble that witnessed unspeakable acts has cracked and weathered under Mediterranean sun and rain. But the truth of what happened there remains, preserved in fragment of text, in architectural evidence, in the archaeological record of institutional evil. These stones remember what we've tried to forget, and they testify still to the depths of human cruelty when power faces no constraints and victims have no protection except the mercy of their destroyer. Caracalla found no mercy in his end, and history has found none for his memory.